You'll recall that variables refer to any property or characteristic that can vary across a population or differ across a population, or a property of people or objects that takes on two or more values. So for example, the humans on the right vary by height, they vary by color, they vary by sex. We have males and females. So height, color, and sex are the variables through which we can define this population. This sample. The saguaro cacti here vary by height. There are different heights, number of arms, number of ridges, number of spines vary. The diameter at the base varies. There are probably many more things that vary among these saguaro. And so all of those things are the variables. And we just name them with one word if possible. And if we look around, you can take any object that you see and think of how it might vary among other people. Perhaps you're looking at a computer screen right now and you think, what variables are there on computer screens? Well, there could be something like touch screen or not a touch screen. There could be the size of the screen, the resolution of the screen, many things that could vary even just about computer screens. And that's the idea. And then we've talked earlier about how each variable has values. So each variable has a set of possible values. So if we say computer screens, the example I just gave, and we're looking at the size of computer screens, we would probably be looking at that diagonal measure, and we might have ranges from 11 inches or something like that, all the way up to maybe 60 inches on the diameter. If the variable is color, the values might be red, green, blue, and so forth. If the variable is age, we might have any number between 0 and 120 as possible ages. If the variable is happiness measured on the 10-point scale, then every number between 1 and 10 are the values. And then a score is any value, so here are the values, that has been selected or earned by an individual. So if the variable is grade point average, GPA, the values would be any number from 0 to 4, and then the score, well, Terry's score would be 3.5 if that's her GPA. If this variable color that we looked at here, we asked what is your favorite color, and these are the values, and you chose green, well then your score would be green. If the variable is age, and of course we have all of these possible values, and I asked you your age and you said 34, then your score is 34. And that's just a way of organizing our language around these concepts. If the variable is text messages per day, and the value, I don't know, any number between 0 and 1,000 maybe, and then the score, Serena sent or received 25 text messages yesterday, so 25 is Serena's score. And then we talked about quantitative versus qualitative variables. And quantitative are variables that can be measured with a number, like shoe size, tree height, number of children, nose length, antibodies in a milliliter of blood, days without smoking. All of these would have answers that are numbers, or values that are numbers. And qualitative or categorical variables are measured in categories. So favorite color, we just give a word. Ethnicity, we give a word. There's not a number. Gender, we give a word. Male, female, whatever. High school, we might give a word like a year, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Or if this variable name means the name of your high school, then we would give the name of the high school. College major, we're going to give a word. There's not a number. And so forth. Now from there, we can talk about independent and dependent variables in a study and an experiment. And so when we think of an independent variable, we're thinking of whatever the researcher is doing to cause differences in something she's interested in measuring. So let's look carefully at this simple example. So in this case, the dependent variable, or what the researcher is interested in, well, we have three. She's interested in the size of the plant, quantitative variable. She's interested in the number of leaves, another quantitative variable. and she's interested in whether the plant lives under different conditions. And so she thinks that these dependent variables, the size of the plant, the number of the leaves, and whether the plant lives, depends on the amount of water. And you can see that she gave this plant on the left a moderate amount of water, this plant in the middle a lot of water, and this plant on the end a little water. And you can see the results. Too much water resulted in a dead plant, too little resulted in a plant that wasn't flourishing, and just the right amount resulted in a flourishing plant. And so the independent variable is what she manipulated, and she manipulated the amount of water. The dependent variable is what she measured, what she thought would depend on the independent variable, or on the amount of water, and the size of plant, number of leaves, whether they're living or dead. Let's look at another example. Another example might be something like this. Let's imagine that someone, a doctor or a public health student, is interested in some measure of health, and she's got some way of measuring this dependent variable of health. And she thinks that there's some sort of a medicine that's going to contribute to it. So she has one treatment that's the real medicine, some sort of supplement that she thinks will help the health of people, and then a control group, a placebo, a sugar pill without her important medicine in it that she doesn't think will help. And so she gives the medicine, randomly assigns her participant to either have the real medicine or the fake medicine. Ideally, she doesn't know if they're getting the real or the fake. But she always gathers their health data, and at the end of the study, then she opens up, she discovers whether they had the real or the fake, after she's determined whether there's any difference between these two groups. So the health is the DV, or dependent variable, that she thinks will depend on the medicine type. For another example, let's consider this. Let's consider that someone, let's start with a dependent variable, is interested in alcohol abuse. And she's going to measure it by, there's a scale each week that's valid. We'll talk about what this means in a couple weeks. And she measures it for 6 months after treatment. During treatment and then after treatment, she takes a measure of where they are in terms of alcohol abuse. So that's the dependent variable. And she thinks that alcohol abuse is going to depend on this intervention. And she particularly believes that Alcoholics Anonymous is a more effective intervention than group therapy. And so she's going to compare. She's randomly assigning some of the people who have come for treatment to Alcoholics Anonymous that has particular tenets and maybe more of a spiritual focus. And she randomly assigns some others to get group therapy, which some people also believe to be important, but it's different from AA. And then she takes these measures. So the independent variable is the type of intervention, with the values Alcoholics Anonymous and the value control group therapy. And the dependent variable is alcohol abuse. That depends on the intervention. So here's some way to phrase it. The dependent variable is the variable that's being measured, or that might be expected to change as a result of the treatment. The independent variable is the variable that's manipulated by the researcher. The experimental condition, condition 1, would usually be the experimental condition or the medicine or treatment that we think will impact the dependent variable. And condition 2 is the control condition, or the condition that's exactly like the experimental condition but lacks the key ingredient. So this is a classic paradigm. It's also called a randomized control trial. It's how most medicines in this country are tested. And it's with subject and researcher not knowing whether the patients have had the medicine or the placebo until all the data are collected and analyzed. So This is how they're defined, and you could, of course, have more conditions than just 2. You could have many conditions. So let's do some examples. What is the independent variable and dependent variable? A researcher studied whether children who ate high-sugar breakfast cereals were more likely to behave aggressively during recess than children who ate low-sugar breakfast cereals. And so what is being measured? Aggressive behavior. What does aggressive behavior depend on? High-sugar breakfast cereals or low-sugar breakfast cereals. So we would say the variable and the independent variable in this case is the breakfast cereal type. High sugar versus low sugar are the values. And the dependent variable is aggression. A scientist suspected that people were more likely to butt into a line or a queue that was made up of strangers than a line or queue of people that was made up of acquaintances. And so in this case, the behavior that's being measured is line butting, I guess we would say. So that would be the dependent variable. And the independent variable that is manipulated by the researcher is whether the line is made up of friends or acquaintances or strangers. So the queue composition is the independent variable, and line butting is what's being measured, the dependent variable. Andrea thought that people would remember a list of words more accurately if they slept than if they did not sleep after studying the list. So what is it that she's going to measure? Well, she's going to measure how many words they recall, how accurate they are, and what she's going to manipulate is whether they sleep after studying the list or they aren't allowed to sleep after studying the list. So we would say sleep is the independent variable, and word memory is the dependent variable. She thinks word memory depends on sleep. In the classic studies that you've all watched by now, we have, you've gotten the gist of these, and this class divided is a study in which a third grade teacher wanted to demonstrate to white children in her class the effects of racism and prejudice on the person experiencing it. And she did that, as you know, by randomly deeming either blue-eyed children or brown-eyed children to be inferior and observing the outcomes throughout the school day, the couple days that this took place. The independent variable then is perceived membership in a subordinate group, believing that your group is subordinate. Blue eyes were inferior versus brown eyes inferior. So did we see different responses when people thought that their group was inferior? And the dependent variables that she measured were academic outcomes, emotional outcomes, and long-term attitudes. And as you'll see, or as we've already perhaps discussed, she was a third grade teacher who wanted to impact her children and teach a lesson. And so she wasn't gathering the kind of systematic data, quantitative data that we might gather if we were a researcher doing the same experiment. And so that's a little bit of a difference between this very important study and the typical research study. And video that's available for you if you haven't seen it. The Asch conformity study. This study you've also seen, and it's one where the researcher showed individuals pictures of lines and asked them to tell whether line A, line B, line C was the same length as line X. So they think that this is a test of perception, of distance perception. And at first, of course, all the Confederates, the guys who are working with the researcher, give the correct answers. And the guy who's coming in to be the subject also gives the correct answer. But after a while, the Confederates all start to give the wrong answer, saying that line C is the same size as line X, when it clearly isn't. And what they're looking at is, what does this participant do? And so in this case, the thing that's being measured, the dependent variable, is to what extent does the individual conform to the group error? And the independent variable, the thing that the researcher manipulates, is whether the group of people the confederates are giving the wrong answer, or giving the correct answer, or a control condition in which the person is alone. And so you can see the data here that do not conform in the red bar and conform in the blue bar, and you can just see what the results are, even though the answer is so obviously wrong. And there's the video if you need to see that. Still, the Bobo doll experiment, the one that we're looking at in particular, is children who watched a video of either randomly assigned to either a violent video, where an adult violently attacked this Bobo doll and beat it up, or a video in which the adult just played with the Bobo doll. And in this case, the thing that was manipulated by the researcher is what film the children watched. Were they exposed to aggression? Video of adult punching doll, video of adult playing with Bobo versus control. So that's what the researcher manipulated or did to people, and what she measured is aggression. To what extent does the child behave aggressively to the Bobo doll? And you can see here that in the aggressive model, these are the different types of aggression that were seen, and so the purple bar represents how the number of children who were acting aggressively in the case of watching an aggressive model versus no model and a non-aggressive model. And there's the video. And in that previous example of the Bobo doll, we would say that the aggressive behavior of the children depended on the video that they'd seen. And the Loftus car crash study, in which individuals witnessed a car crash on a video screen and then were asked questions to see how well they remembered the details of a crash, and in particular, how much the car who hit the other car was speeding. And so this is how they set it up. The independent variable was what we might call word bias. Participants asked at what speed was the car traveling when it crashed into the other car, and then they changed the phrasing of it. Collided with the other car, bumped the other car, rammed the other car, hit the other car, impacted. So they changed the valence or emotion of the words they used. And you can see up here that the more violent the words that were used in the interview, the higher the eyewitnesses estimated the speed. And so the dependent variable was the estimates of the car speeds that they thought depended on the words that were used in the questioning. And this became important in understanding eyewitness testimony. And there's that video. And the Good Samaritan study that we've seen, where the goal was to determine whether a sense of urgency would impact prosocial behavior or helping a stranger that was injured on the road. And in this case, the independent variable was the sense of urgency. This is what the researchers manipulated. And they did that by either telling participants you'll be late versus you'll be just on time if you leave now versus you'll get there with a few minutes to spare. So that's the independent variable was manipulated by the researchers. And the dependent variable is prosocial behavior, help offered to an injured stranger. So let's do a few more examples. Researchers wanted to know whether people were happier giving or receiving. To test this, they gave people $5 and randomly assigned them to either condition 1, spend the money on yourself, condition 2, spend the money on someone else, condition 3, a control condition with no instructions about what to do with the money. They asked all the people to return to the lab at the end of the day, where they were given a measure of happiness. What is the independent and dependent variable? IV is money instructions, self versus other versus control. And the dependent variable is happiness. They thought that would depend on how the participants use the money. Or Dr. Smith wanted to know whether children's reading fluency was better when they read to a gentle dog than to another person. So in this case, the independent variable, the thing that is manipulated by the researcher, is who is the listener? Is it a dog or is it a human? And the dependent variable is reading fluency. Taloma wanted to know whether people were more likely to help a stranger who dropped books after being told they would be well loved later in life than when they were told they might be alone later in life. And in this case, the independent variable is the prediction. You're going to be lonely versus you're going to be loved. And the dependent variable is helping behavior. And so that is the end of this content. I hope you find it helpful as you take the practice quiz.